Hey there, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today I have with me Henry Lopez. Henry is a serial entrepreneur, small business coach and consultant, and the host of the How to Business podcast. Henry, welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay, first of all, what is a serial entrepreneur? I hear this a lot, but it's fun to hear what people say about this. It's interesting.
It is. I think honestly, I'm a wannabe serial entrepreneur. The way that I define it, because when I'm splitting hairs, when I'm defining what is a business owner versus an entrepreneur, an entrepreneur is someone who leverages resources, a team of people in a business where I don't have to be there and it still generates income. You
Mm.
know? So I think that someone who gets a business to that level is an entrepreneur. And when you can do that multiple times, that's when you add the serial part. The reality is I've had mixed results, right? There are some businesses where I've had to stay very much engaged, a couple businesses where I was in fact able to step back. But that's my definition of a serial entrepreneur.
Yeah. And what businesses are you involved with or have a hand in now?
So yeah, good question. I'm kind of in between major businesses. My wife has a travel consulting business. I help her a little bit with that, but she's actively involved with that. I'm a minority partner in a franchise that a family member of mine owns, and that's called Office Evolution, which is a shared office space franchise. And then, of course, my primary business right now is the coaching and consulting. So they are very much hands-on. I'm in the business delivering the services, but those are primarily what keeps me busy now.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so what were you like when you were a kid? Like
Oh God.
did you have businesses back then or like did your family sit around the table and talk about business a lot?
Mm,
Like my husband's family, he lived in a funeral home. And
interesting.
so they constantly talked about like health and business and what you were going to do, and everybody went into the to all three boys went into the medical field. Like, but it's that dinner time conversation kind of stuff that I think is fascinating about.
Absolutely.
What was yours like?
Yeah, mine was unique and not unique in that I am the son of immigrant parents and family. So my parents and my grandparents at the same time were immigrants from Cuba when Castro took over. So it's that unique experience to immigrant families where they were entrepreneurial by necessity.
Yeah.
So they had to leave behind everything, whatever education they did or didn't have, whatever employment they did or didn't have, and then they had to scrap it together. And that's one of the reasons why South Florida, where I grew up for the most part as a child, is one of the biggest concentrations of small businesses in the country because out of necessity, my family had to create and invent. You know, my grandfather did everything from fixing washing machines back when you could fix them actually to doing pest control to, whatever. He had a truck for a while delivering truckloads of topsoil and sand. So very entrepreneurial. My dad was a carpenter, mostly worked for himself, although he never could figure out how to get it beyond being a solo entrepreneur. So yeah, those influences were all there. I was not necessarily one of those kids that had the lemonade stand. I was very shy, very reserved,
Hmm.
lacked a lot of confidence, but that influence was there because of the subculture bubble that I grew up in.
That's interesting. What mindset do you think that instilled in you to be a second generation Cuban
Mhm.
American?
Survival, getting ahead. Of course, like every other entrepreneur, excuse me, every other immigrant family throughout the history of this country, which is what makes this country so great. It's about not wasting that sacrifice that our parents and grandparents had to make.
Mm.
And so for them, for us, to some extent, it was about getting to school, although not necessarily college, although that was there, but just getting through grade school and making something of yourself. So there was always that impetus on where, making a living because we didn't have much of a safety net. I look back now and I'm amazed by the fact that my parents never, throughout our childhood, ever had health insurance, for example.
Hmm.
No, it was back in the day where you could actually go to a doctor and it wasn't going to be $10,000, right, to have an x-ray. But nonetheless, no savings, no retirement except for whatever Social Security was going to provide. So I think that was the motivation. Am I answering your question?
Oh yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you think that's impacted your approach to business ownership and even coaching and consulting?
Mhm. Well, for me personally, it's been great, and it's also been a challenge or a problem. In other words, I still come of it and look at money and building a business as a need for survival, even though it's long past that, fortunately. I was challenged with this. I was raising my daughter. We just have one child. She's 25 now and lives in Manhattan, grown, and so she's off in her life. But I always worried she's not going to have the same motivation that I had. The only motivation I knew was survival. In other words, I didn't have a safety net. I
Hmm.
couldn't go back home really. And that was my motivator. That was my fuel. So, but the problem with that is that eats at you after a while, right? And at some point you have to start to feel okay that everything's going to be okay, but you never really do, is my experience. So there's pluses and minuses to that motivation, that source of motivation, which is the fear of the financial impact of failing at business or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So you were talking about how when you were younger, you were a little quieter, more reserved, and then eventually you started to get into small business ownership yourself. So was there a shift in I mean, now you're a podcaster, so you're
Right.
talking a lot.
Mhm.
So when did that shift happen for you? You started to feel like you really had a voice.
Yeah, that's a good question. I am an introvert. I still am an introvert. I think that what helped me tremendously was so I had a career that was just kind of a matter of opportunities and breaks and a little bit of luck. I ended up in sales, in specifically in high end enterprise software sales. So selling software, enterprise planning software, financials, and so forth to large corporations. Started at it back in '89 when I moved to Dallas, and then throughout the '90s. And then I had a business on the side. We'll come back to that, but I was making very good money in my sales career. But the reason I'm going that route to answer your question is that early on, it kind of, I knew I always had an ability to communicate. That was just a strength, a natural strength. And I was always ahead in reading and in reading comprehension. And so the sales opportunity allowed me to fine tune that. And I had really good mentors and really good training and really good education through that whole process to become consciously competent at how to communicate effectively, in my case, in the arena of sales. But I do believe that that is such a strength for especially business owners to be able to sell. And I'm not just talking about the traditional aspects of selling, although that's critical, but selling in the regards of how do you communicate. I'm talking about, the focus of your show. How do you influence people, whether it's your team or investors or potential vendors or customers? That's such a key skill, I think, for an entrepreneur or a business owner to have. So that confidence that I got through being successful in sales, I can do this. Ooh, I'm good at this. Oh, I can get better at it. I think that's what allowed me to find my voice.
Hmm. And were you excited about going into sales or did that make you really nervous?
I didn't really know what it was. The connotation I had about sales was, the salesperson that had sold me a car before, right? The traditional, very icky, manipulative, high pressure type of sales. That's all I knew sales to be. I didn't even know there was this world of sales at a corporate level, a B2B level of sales. But I was fortunate that the first job I got was a hybrid. I was doing some implementations of the software and then a little bit of selling, and that allowed me to get a taste of it.
Hmm.
And then me and management realized, oh, you're really good at the selling part of it as well. And so it allowed me to segue into it without having to just jump in head first.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you realized that together and
Mm-hmm.
that that turned into just another opportunity that you could seize. I think a lot of people, I mean anybody is kind of nervous to try something that's new or very
Absolutely.
different. So I also think that that's one of the cool things about what business, and people going to work really does is like it pushes
Mm-hmm.
us out of our comfort zone sometimes in ways that really allow us to do things like find our voice. Like how cool is
Right.
that?
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And then listen, I had some good mentors along the way, had some good breaks along the way. and put in the effort also to get better at it, to
Mm,
become better at it, to develop that craft, that ability, that skill.
yeah. So then you started a business on the side, it sounds like. Do you want
Correct.
to tell
Yeah.
me
So,
about how you got going?
yeah, one of my childhood friends actually, who had also previously to me moving to the Dallas. So I grew up in South Florida for the most part, then moved to Dallas when I was 24. Just quit my job in Miami. It was time to go. I was a child of divorced parents, and so at age 17, when my dad left, I had to become the head of the household along with my mom, who had been a housewife for 18 years. But several years down the road, I'm 24. She got remarried. Things were more stable. I needed to go make my own life, so I moved to Dallas. And I had some friends there who actually had lived in the Hialeah, South Florida area where I lived as well. And he had worked. His name is Renee. He had worked at a franchise called Mr. Jim's that's local to Texas. They've got about 60 units, primarily in the DFW area. He had worked there during high school and as he was going to college, junior college. And so he had the experience, and he and I had talked about, he also had aspirations to start his own business. So together we partnered. We bought an existing location. The guy was desperate to get out of it. He offered us seller financing because we didn't have any resources.
Yeah, that's
I didn't
great.
have any credit. But fortunately, and so my partner and friend, he worked it full time, day to day. We paid him a salary. I did everything else at night and on the weekends, from counting coupons to the finances to the planning. And yeah, we ended up having three different locations throughout the 90s. Never could get it to the point where I could leave my career. I was making really good money, but it began to give me that. I certainly developed a lot of experience and began to satisfy that desire to have something of my own.
Mm. So, and then now you have you have these businesses. I'm sure it sounds like you've probably dabbled in some other things along the way. I'm kind of wondering what is something that you've learned in small business ownership that you might not have learned any other way?
Oh gosh. Well, certainly as I compare it to my corporate career, and I see it then for people who are, often a lot of my listeners are fall into one or two categories: existing small business owners and people who aspire to start their business, and usually they're in the corporate world or working somewhere. I think that the biggest thing the thing that's a challenge is when we're working for someone else, even if we're at a pretty senior position, there are other people either above us or with us that are making or helping us make those hard decisions, right?
Mm.
I probably don't go to bed at night worrying about whether we're going to make payroll or not. I might, but typically I'm not, right? Then I make this transition into business ownership, and it's a very lonely pursuit. Now, if you've got a partner, that helps tremendously to share some of that burden. But now every decision has to be made by you and your partners. You can't, ask somebody or a committee or somebody else to make the decision. And then, of course, we have to hold ourselves accountable because we're going to deal with the consequences of that decision. That can be paralyzing. I think you have to be ready. I call it, being willing and ready to embrace decision making. You have to want to be the person that makes the hard decisions. And I think that's an area that's a big difference between maybe the corporate world and being a business owner that I wasn't expecting, certainly.
Yeah, you have to be willing to. Did you find that you were pretty good at it right away, or did was that experimentation kind of hard to get going and all that?
I mean, it was hard, but listen, I had arrogance, if nothing else, right? I had an ego. And I always felt like, gosh, I want to make the decisions. Good, bad, or indifferent. That was one of the things that frustrated me about being in the corporate world is somebody else putting a level on what influence I could have, what decisions I could make. That always rubbed me the wrong way. And part of it was just, silly and stupid arrogance, but some of it was confidence in my abilities to go do. So what I think I had a natural preponderancy for is to have enough confidence. Now, trust me, there's plenty of sleepless nights, right? But enough confidence. And I figured out pretty early on that the thing isn't that you're always going to make the right decision, but that you're probably going to make more right decisions than wrong decisions. Yeah. And if you just have the confidence and accept that every decision you make isn't going to be perfect, but you're willing to accept that, I think that's what gave me the confidence, that reality check of I'm not pretending to be 100%, although certainly that perfectionist side creeps in. But I think that it didn't allow me to paralyze myself on making those decisions. I see that happening often, for example, when people are looking to start a business.
Mm,
Once it gets hard, past the idea that's exciting, and then you got to start doing things and you got to start making decisions. You got to start spending money. That's when I see people get paralyzed. And I think it comes back to this point, Andrea, is that, boy, now I'm having to make these big decisions. And there's no lifeline that I can call and say, all right, if I do this, will this be guaranteed to work out? No, there's no such thing, right?
yeah.
So I have to take a little bit of a leap of faith. And that's, I think, is a hard thing that I think naturally I wanted that, I think is what helped me get through that.
Yeah, yeah. When you're coaching small business owners, are you finding that a lot of those folks have that natural propensity to want to be the decision maker and that sort of thing, or that some people have a hard time embracing that side of it?
I think it's a mix. I think it's a
Mhm.
mix. I think that's certainly one of the ways that you can identify if you're ready.
Hmm.
I think it's a mix. There are people, but then that is one of the things, of course, that then holds people back, or maybe they're not quite ready. Because I think sometimes people confuse the fact that I hate my job or I hate my boss, and that the solution is to start a business. That's not always the case for everybody, right? And this component of it, I think, comes into play, Andrea. Really being honest with yourself as to whether that's who you are right now.
Hmm.
Everybody's capable of it, but it may not be right now. And so maybe what you need is a better job or a better work situation.
When you think about your own personal decision-making criteria, what kinds of things come to mind?
When it comes to business decision making, so first and foremost, my ultimate question I ask myself, especially like when I'm starting a new business, let's say we're talking about those kind of decisions, it's what's the worst case scenario.
Hmm.
So let's keep it in that context. I'm going to start a business. I'm going to invest X amount of money. I'm going to commit to a lease. I'm going to commit to a loan, whatever that might entail. If this business fails 3 years from now, what's the impact on me and my family? Is it devastating? Will the kids not get to go to school? Do I have to sell the house? All right, well, that to me is too much risk. People have this misconception that all business owners and entrepreneurs are high risk takers. That is not the way I see myself. In fact, I think I'm fairly risk averse, but others will look at me and think, oh my gosh, you're willing to take these risks. It's just how I look at it. I feel I've done the analysis. I've thought through what the worst case scenario is. So then for me, there's risk, but it's not end of the world risk. So that's ultimately decision making. Yeah. Then I also kind of try to think through 2 or 3 steps ahead. It's kind of like playing chess, even though I don't play chess. It's when you make a decision, I've gotten pretty good now instinctively of then asking, okay, then what's going to happen? If I do this, what will happen next? Or what could possibly happen? Or how might this person perceive it? Or how might my customers react? So I'll think through those scenarios and then come back and make the decision. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have to weigh the types of decisions because every decision can't take you forever to make. So, there's a great book, Gladwell, I can't remember his first name, wrote the book Blink,
Malcolm?
Malcolm Gladwell, Blink, where he talks about how we make these, what we might call a gut decision or a quick decision. And what he explains in part in that book, that's not really what's happening. We're leaning on our years of experience, hours of experience to what might seemingly be a quick decision, but it's based and it's informed by all of that experience. And I think that's how I look at it.
Yeah, yeah. And I would imagine that somehow your values probably come into play.
Sure.
What's your experience of small businesses that are kind of getting going, getting on their feet, and what's your take on needing values or how to even use them in a small business context?
That's interesting. That's a good question. I think that the values that are important, and this gets complicated or multiplied when you have partners, yeah, because
Mm,
you got to make sure your values are in alignment. So we'll come back to that part of it because I think that complicates things. I think where it comes into play is you have to know where you draw the line on things that you're going to do or not do, compromises that you're going to make or not make, sacrifices that you're going to make or not make. Overall, the way that I've applied it in part is I look at it as when I start a business or create a business or ongoing deliver a product, it represents me. So I always look at it as, how do I want to be perceived? So to give you an example, one of our businesses that I started with a partner that we started and sold was a frozen yogurt shop. I don't know if you've been to one where you self-serve, you serve yourself the yogurt and then you put the toppings on it. Really, it's a candy store under disguise for the kids, but we created that from scratch. 10 years into it, people would come in and say, is this a franchise? Because it looks like it just opened yesterday. Or we love the customer service and we love the experience. That to me was my representation of my values. In other words, in that regard there, how do I want to be treated when I'm a customer or a client, and making sure that that drives our decision making. Then I think it also is represented in how we treat our team, our people.
Mm.
They are employees, but how do we treat them? Do we provide a fair and equitable environment for them? To me, that's not just lip service. That's part of my values getting applied to my business. So I think I'm answering your
Yeah.
question, but that's how it comes into play for me.
Yeah. And then you mentioned it can be a little more complicated when you have a partner. So
Absolutely.
talk about that.
Because this is the biggest mistake I see people make in partnerships. We go into it assuming that nothing could ever go wrong. We're best friends, or I mean, I've been in partnership with friends, with family members, all of the things they tell you not to do, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I've had great successes and great failures. And the number one thing I suggest, I have a checklist actually that people can download, which is a partnership checklist, is to have those really deep, frank conversations up front before you start,
Mm.
before you sign a partnership agreement. Have a partnership agreement. It's amazing to me how many people go into business together and there's no formal partnership agreement. So all of those things, because what can happen is that even has happened to me, even in great partnerships, is we might be in alignment up front. We got to make sure we are, but then we change, right? We
Mm.
grow, our life changes. The success or lack of success of the business impacts us in different ways. We have life events that happen to us separately that adjust or impact our values, right? So continuously making sure we're in alignment, and that includes communicating. That's the key to making sure that those values don't get crossed, because that's what leads to major disagreements, I think, is this point of the values, if you want to
Mm.
put it to that term. I believe we should go this way. I believe we should treat this way. I believe we should, go forward this direction, not this direction, because it's where I want to go, because it aligns with me and my values. Now it doesn't align with my partners. That's what creates a lot of disputes.
Yeah, yeah. So you said that you've been partners with friends and family, all the people you're told not to do that with. But I do wonder, like when you're advising people and what you've observed with partnership, like what makes a good partner? How do you sort of decide whether or not it makes sense to try a partnership or not?
Absolutely. Yeah. Brilliant question. And I think that what's hard is that if it's your first business ventures, then you may not know, right? But here's the thing. I have figured out over time that I work better in partnership, but not everybody's the same. I've known
Mm.
plenty of business owners who are the lone wolf type. They want to be in full control and not make any compromises. Now, that's hard to know going into business for the first time, but we got to try to analyze that part of it. And part
Mm.
of that is having those deep conversations that I alluded to early on before you get started, to see that'll help you maybe bring out, maybe I should be doing this by myself. Because one of the mistakes people will make is to go into partnership because I need that person's money. Well, maybe what you need is an investor, not a partner in that case. But I know I'm someone now over time that works best in partnership. But there's three things. It's trust. That's hard to build if you don't know the person. So I rarely, actually, I've never gone into business where there's an equity split or I don't have some kind of relationship pre-existing with that person. So there's
Hmm.
got to be a level of trust. So the person I've partnered with the most is David Begin. We knew each other when we started working together back in 1991, and we started our first business together in the 2000s. So a lot of trust, a lot of knowledge, we were friends. Yeah.
Mm.
Again, that can have detriment, but certainly trust. Second is respect. So I respected him and his abilities, and he respected me. There's got to be mutual respect. Going back to the money, if the only reason I would have brought him into partnership, well, he's got the money, but I don't respect him otherwise, that's doomed to fail, right? Then he should probably be an investor, not an active partner. There's a difference, obviously.
Mm,
And then number three is communication. We talked about it already. Communication up front and communication throughout. The communication is critical, like it is in any relationship. This is like a marriage, and even more so.
yeah.
You have to have that level of communication. So trust, respect, and communication is what leads you to having the best possible partnership. But then at the foundation of it has to be a solid partnership agreement that covers all kinds of things, including what if things change for me and I want out, or conversely, or something happens, or what if I become incapacitated and now my wife all of a sudden wants to take over my role in the business? Is that what you want? That's not who you went into business with, right? So all of those things that we don't think about really, that topic of exiting, whether it's voluntary or not, if you've got those things covered and you agree to them, that avoids a lot of those huge problems that can paralyze and kill a business later.
Mm, yeah, I can give a big here to that. Um, okay, so small business owners wear a lot of hats
Mm.
and they have different kinds of responsibilities and stressors. Um, I guess I'm kind of wondering what you recommend that people do, small business owners do, to maintain their own mental health and well-being.
Mm. Good question. That's again another reason why you might want to partner,
Mm,
because that to me has been my source of, like, hopefully when you're down or you're looking at things negatively, your partner picks you up and vice versa. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, a coach, a mentor can help with that as well. A peer group can help with that. Even it might be as simple as belonging to the chamber and getting together with other business owners on a regular basis. You got to talk about it and commiserate with others that are going through the same thing. So that's key. Then, and I always ask this question up front: what's the support at home, whether you're married or a spouse or a relationship or whatever? If you have that, that person needs to be on board, because there are going to be some tough times. They're going to have to understand. They're going to have to support you through the ups and downs. It's great if they're involved as well, but that's not always the case. But I think that's how we address it. And then I think it's become so much more, though. I mean, if you had asked me that question 20 years ago, I would have said, yeah, you're talking about woo-woo stuff. We don't talk about that stuff. Now it's because, especially for the guys, not to generalize, but for the guys where it's traditionally been more difficult to admit that that might be even something that I'm challenged with, I think it's become so much more open and acceptable to talk about these things. Yeah.
mm,
I think the advent of podcasts has helped tremendously, because I can
yeah.
listen to others and that are having the same challenges, and how did they deal with, oh, so I'm not alone. Other people are struggling. Other people have imposter syndrome. All of those things. I think if we take that in, we talk about it, we find people that understand what we're going through. I think that's the key to it, in my
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. And then I guess it's also hard to turn it all off when you get home. So that idea of work-life boundaries, or work-life, what most people, like a lot of people now want to call integration. Um,
Mm.
you know, what are your thoughts on how to maintain a healthy home environment even when you have a lot on your mind?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I gave up on. I used to believe that, oh, you have to have this distinct delineation. Everything at work stays at work. You don't bring it home. I don't know that that's possible. At least I haven't figured out how to do
Yeah.
it. But here's how I'll answer that question in part. What I was very conscious of is, when my daughter was younger and we were business owners, the research I had seen and what I had heard from other business owners is one of the top reasons why kids don't want to take over their parents' businesses is all they've ever heard at the dinner table are the headaches and the problems and the challenges, and we're getting sued, or we're having this problem.
Yeah.
That's all they hear, right? So what I did, which I think helped me in more ways than one, is I made sure that my daughter didn't just hear the negative stuff at the dinner table. I made sure that she also understood the reason I can show up tomorrow for your recital or play or whatever, or take you to school or go to lunch. It was a big thing for her when she was in elementary school on Fridays for the parents to come to lunch. And, my wife and I were maybe one of 10 that might have had that flexibility.
Mm.
But the reasons I can do that is because I have the flexibility, the freedom of time, and because I'm a business owner. And I always make sure she understood that. And I remember brilliantly one time, and I'm not going to get it verbatim, there was like a rash of her friends' dads or moms as well, but mostly dads getting laid off. As cyclical in business as it is, or in the economy as it is. And she said to me unprompted, Dad, that's why I'm glad you have your own business, because you can't get laid off. And I was like, wow, I did something right. She gets that. Yeah. Now, there's all kinds of other risks, of course, right? That I'm exposed to, but she got it. She got it, right? So it's a long roundabout way, Andrea, to answer this question. I think that there has to be some separation. If I come home and all I talk about is business, 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 then other people around me are going to find me insufferable, right? At the same time, that's what I'm passionate about.
Mm.
That's what I want to talk about the most. So I try to strike a balance. I try to compartmentalize, but the reality is that the way that I've addressed it is to make sure that the only thing I bring home isn't the negative. Does that
Yeah,
make
that's
sense?
that's a great that's a great perspective and
Mm.
reminder. I think for all of us, that's a really good one. Sometimes it's hard to have team members who may not understand why you're making decisions or
Sure,
the
sure.
bigger picture, that sort of thing. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how to help employees kind of get that bigger picture, a broader perspective that might help them to understand why things are the way they are,
Right.
or why it's not simple to just make the change that they want to make or whatever.
Hmm. Yeah, or when they come to you with ideas, why I don't immediately implement them, or why it may not work right now, all of those
Yeah.
things are a big challenge. What I have found has worked best for me is some level of transparency on, as you phrased it, the bigger picture, as well as perhaps to some extent the financials. Not complete transparency, because that can create problems, but transparency related to the KPIs or the measures that I'm going to use to measure them individually or the group that they're responsible for, or whatever it is that they have influence over. For example, I've been in the restaurant business, as I mentioned. There, it's all about labor and food costs. So if those are the two KPIs I'm going to measure you on, Andrea, I'm going to make sure you have complete transparency and visibility to the underlying numbers that add up to labor and to food costs, right? I think that providing them access to that bigger picture, often it means the financial components of it to some degree, allows them to understand why I'm making these bigger picture decisions, and why I may not take your suggestion, or why I'm doing this, or why I'm asking you to do something. That has helped me tremendously. Is it 100% foolproof? No. You're still going to have to make the hard decisions at the end of the day. It's still not impossible, but difficult for someone who's in an employee capacity to get the complete vision, because their horizon is shorter, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're thinking in a smaller time frame, understandably.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot expect them to have the same level of long-term thinking as the owner. And so that's the other thing I've done, is understand where their motivation lies in that time horizon, and making sure that I communicate as effectively in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah.
That's how I've tried to address it.
Yeah. And I know that like it can be hard to take time though to address all the people concerns and but yet communication is so important. It's just
Mm-hmm.
not always possible as a small business owner to do a great job communicating and
Yeah.
letting people know what's going on even what are the things that they should be making sure to communicate well.
Of course, this is exacerbated by the size of your team, right? If you've got a
Yeah.
smaller organization, it's not as hard, or shouldn't be as hard. As your team grows, or as you have different level of employees, managers, and I've had situations business where I have managers and shift leaders, and then frontline employees, that gets more difficult, because You need your leaders within the organization to carry that message forward. I think that the thing that has worked best is that regular cadence of meetings or get-togethers or opportunities for communication, but that provide for real communication, right? Gino Wickman teaches this, or used to, as he founded EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System, what they call the level 10 meetings, right? So having that cadence of meetings, there's been so much that has been said about how meetings are a waste of time, and I think it just caught on as a popular thing that meetings are a waste of time. I don't believe that. I think it is one of the ways that we have an opportunity to communicate effectively. Now, you got to run the meeting the right way, but providing that opportunity to make sure you're communicating consistently. Here's what we're doing. Here's how we're doing. Let's highlight those who are doing it well. That's critical. Then the other thing is, first of all, that you hire well, but then that you lead and coach your leaders, your managers, your supervisors, whatever the structure might be, to make sure that they're continuously coaching, that they're continuously giving feedback, positive as well as constructive, right? And creating that kind of an environment. That's what I've seen has worked best in my businesses.
Mm. Based on your work with small business owners and podcast interviews, all kinds of things, like what do you think are the top concerns of small business owners now, like 2024?
Today, everybody is still thinking, oh, there might be a recession. So it's the economic outlook.
Yeah.
And that does frustrate me because, so much of it is politicized and so much of it is, doom and gloom.
Hmm.
It relates to the question I often get asked, is this a good time to start a business? And I always quote Dickens, the little bit of Dickens that I know, which is the best of time is the worst of times, right? Other than if you told me you were going to start a restaurant in the middle of the pandemic, or I'm going to start a mortgage brokerage in 2008, there are obvious timing challenges. Yeah. But I think that is the biggest thing that I see is that concern of the economy. But I think it becomes an excuse. I think it becomes an easy scapegoat for why my business isn't growing or why people aren't buying what I'm selling. And that's what bothers me about it. We may or may not be going into recession. That's fine. The other thing is interest rates. People complaining about interest rates. Although when I ask people or when I think about, well, how is it directly impacting a small micro business? I don't know. I don't know that it really is. But those are the things that I hear. Now, the one that is real, that's impacting everybody, is getting a little bit better, is the labor shortage.
Hmm.
But what I've come to learn and believe from everybody that I've read, people that I've talked to, people that I've had the opportunity to interview on my show, is that it has little to do with what, again, the politicized version of people don't want to work. I don't think that's true. What it is just less people in the labor workforce, and that will continue to be a challenge for small business owners. That is only going to get smaller. There are more jobs available than there are people to fill them. If we happen to have any kind of a service-related business, so we're hiring either customer service people or frontline workers of any kind, tight labor pool. So what does that mean? We've got to get more creative as small business owners as to how do we attract and retain good people, and to make them more productive, how do we apply technology
Hmm.
so that we can do more with less? That's the most real one, I think. What are you seeing? Do you agree with that, the labor shortage and that being a big real concern?
Yeah, definitely. I hear it pretty much everybody that I talk to, the labor shortage is a big concern. Retaining and engaging, keeping them around, but yeah, certainly attracting too.
Mm-hmm.
And I am in agreement with you about how to handle it. Those points that you just made about getting creative and thinking more about their perspective, what they're looking for, but then also getting creative about how you're going to handle and use technology to make up for the shortage. I think is
That's right.
those are all really important points. Hmm.
How do we make it more effective? How do we and the thing that's wonderful now for small businesses is that technology, and I'm talking about technologies of all type. From, when I first started the pizza franchise, obviously we didn't have a POS system. Now you can get an incredibly robust, affordable POS systems and other tools, scheduling tools, and customer support tools. It's all there and it's affordable to the small business owner now, right? So the
Hmm.
technology is only going to become even more so with AI and how we can leverage those tools. They're affordable to us. The thing I see a lot of times small business owners make the mistake of, because they're intimidated by it, they don't understand it, they shy away from it, right? And that's, I think, the big mistake there.
Yeah, yeah. And then to not be afraid of teaching people new skills so that they can move into a different position. So you don't
Exactly
have to
right.
lose them because you're putting a new technology in place. You can reskill somebody, and if they're willing, and still keep them around.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What do you think has changed the most in small business ownership in the last few years?
Oh
Obviously,
boy.
the last few years have been packed.
Yeah, obviously beyond the pandemic. I think it's this point of labor. I think it's the labor challenge.
Yeah.
I really think that's the big thing. Certainly that, and beyond, even before that, the consumer becoming much more, they have a lot more access to information. This is a perfect example in what I did in the 90s, where I was doing software sales, where the process was entirely controlled by the vendor, us having the information. You, the prospective buyer, will give it to you a piece at a time as we want to. We'll manipulate it, we'll control it. Versus now, you move forward 30 years later, and if you were still doing software sales, as I know people still are, by the time you show up, they've already done the research, they've already studied you, they've already seen the demo, they've already done the analysis, right? I think that's applying in all other circles of business, in good and in bad ways. If we apply it, to example, for online reviews and the influence that can have on our business, especially in a B to C situation, the impact of that. Everybody's a critic now, good and bad, but dealing with that is very different than it was 10 years ago, certainly.
What leadership and people skills do you think small business owners need now?
Gosh. I think if we look at it in the context of what we just talked about with the labor shortage, we have to become much more leaders of people than the traditional manager of people. You're just not going to keep the best people if you are creating an environment where you're the dictator and people must follow your rules or nothing. And you create this oppressive environment where you're looking to catch people doing the wrong things. I think instead it has become even more important that as small business owners, we have to be leaders and inspire people.
Hmm.
We have to search for the right people. So we have to attract them with that inspiration. And then we have to, as you alluded to earlier with your question about how do you get them to see the bigger picture? How do we communicate that? How do we instill that? How is that genuine? In other words, especially the younger generation reads through when we've got, the soaring eagle poster, employee of the month, but it's just lipstick on a pig, right? They read through that very quickly, as our customers do, by the way, as to how we genuinely feel about how we treat the customer. So those are all, I think, leadership components that often can get lost, because I understand it. Sometimes I've seen plenty of business owners. It comes to mind a bagel shop that is out of business now here, and I live in South Florida, or mid to South Florida. Bagels are a big thing because there's so many transplants from the Northeast. This one bagel shop, I remember standing in line, and the owner was working behind the counter and he was miserable. And I chatted with him briefly as I was waiting for my bagel order, and he was desperate to get out of this business. I hate the people. Everybody's always fighting. He had gotten to a point where he was miserable in this business. Yeah. And I assure you that that was not a great environment to work in, because what can happen, understandably, to us, Andrea, is being a business owner, you're bombarded every day. It feels like everybody wants to get you. Everybody wants a piece of you, right? Legitimately and otherwise. Everybody has a complaint, it feels like, or everybody wants a
Hmm.
piece of you. You're being taxed. And so you can, if you allow that, turn into an adversarial mindset.
Hmm.
And that then, when you're in that mindset, you can't lead. So that's how I see it, as far as it's more important now than it has ever been as a small business owner, to be a leader.
Yeah, great. Henry, this has been so good. I feel like I've been throwing all kinds of fastballs at you, and every once in a while a slow one maybe, but I think
That's
I
all
think
great.
this has been really fun. Two more questions. Where can people find you and your podcast?
So it's thehowofbusiness.com. Thehowofbusiness.com is the website for the podcast, all of my resources. If you're interested in my coaching programs, you'll find it all at thehowofbusiness.com.
Great. Okay, last question. This is the Voice of Influence podcast. So, what last piece of advice would you want to give somebody who would like to have a voice of influence?
Ooh, gosh, that's a good one. I think that the way I look at it, I was listening to a recent episode you did with Carlos Alvarega,
Yeah.
I think it was his last name,
Yeah.
the rules of persuasion, where it can be used for evil or used for good, right? He was talking about in your episode with him. Um, I think that persuasion, it also ties to, as I was preparing and learning more about your show, or influence rather, it comes into play often in the area and the arena of sales that we talked a lot about in this conversation. So I think that I want you to think about, and people often will say, "Oh, sales. I don't like to do sales. I don't like to do that," because again, they have this preconceived notion of what it is. But I think that influence and this persuasion is really, when it's done well, it's about sharing with others what I have to offer that might be of benefit to them. And if we just concentrate on that, sharing what it is that I'm doing and how I'm doing it well, and seeing if that might be something you're interested in, that's really what it's about. If we boil it down more micro to my team of people, it's again what we've talked about. Influence them and persuading them into buying into what we're trying to do collectively, and why. What's the benefit here? Who are we serving, and how does it benefit all of us? So I think that's the way I would look at it.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, this has been great, Henry. Thank you so much for being a voice of influence today for our listeners and for the work you do with small business owners. It's such an important demographic.
Thank you for the opportunity.